Greetings, you intrepid Herle Burlyites. Hey, I want to take a moment to thank you all for being here week after week. I guess I'm feeling a tad introspective, and it's likely because we're nearing our 5-year pod-versary. Yep, 5 years ago, David Axelrod was our inaugural guest, fresh off an historic Cubs World Series win. Today, the Cubs are 10.5 games back of a wild card spot. They kind of stink. Democracy also seems to be a wild card in the United States these days, and Axelrod is doing what he can to preserve it via his own podcast, The Axe Files. So, democracy in the USA. Writ-large, that's what we'll be talking about with our guest today, Keith Boag, who's making his third appearance on the Herle Burly. In his stellar career at CBC as Chief Political Correspondent with years working in the US, Keith has observed and reported on political discourse down there and stood witness to the erosion of democratic norms. So today we're going to talk about the January 6th hearings. What's the import and the impact? How should Trump be treated going forward? And extrapolating further, what would another Trump term be like? What's the media's role in covering and managing issues and stories like this? What will Joe Biden be doing 2.5 years from now? And who are the other potential nominees for each party? Keith, welcome back to the Herle Burly. It's been too long, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me back. I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate the invitation.
Oh, no, you're always a huge star when you come on the show. We get lots of rave reviews and stuff. So I appreciate you doing it. Tell us about your picture behind you.
Oh, that one. I didn't realize it was going to be in the frame because I set this up differently. And then when we zoomed, it widened everything out. That's an Amy Winehouse portrait done by a Montreal artist that I got a few months ago. And
why?
I need a little bit more. Why?
Yeah.
I don't know. I couldn't stop looking at it. I saw it in the local art shop, and then, I took a picture of it and sent it around to some friends of mine whose judgment I trust better than my own, and kind of like, what do you think of this? Is this like too much? And they loved it. Now, I don't know if you love it. Maybe you hate it.
No, I do love it.
Maybe others.
I do love it.
It doesn't really fit with anything else that I have, and I like that about it as well.
So speaking of art, you were telling me that you have a new favorite show on television. What's it called?
I can't stop watching it. It's a multi-series, a kind of irregular program called the January 6th Committee hearings. I find it riveting. I think it's well produced. I learn lots from it, and it's tremendously entertaining.
Right. What have you learned from the hearings into the January 6th assault on the Capitol? So, we knew a fair bit about it before. What have we learned since that's material?
That's material is an important question. I think we've learned a lot of things, some of which are not necessarily material, but without dwelling too long on it, I think the fact of the thing itself is an important lesson that you can actually have a televised hearing that is presented using what we know or what professionals in television know about telling a story, so that each one of these hearings has been 2 hours long, strictly controlled in time, with a cast of characters that's very limited and very scripted. And it always has a beginning, a middle, and an end, during which they tell you what they're going to tell you, then they tell you what they just told you. And often, perhaps always, they have a little twist at the end so that you'll come back for more. But I think when you say material, you mean, what have we learned that we didn't know before about the subject at hand? I think that the big thing that we have learned some small details, and I don't think we can really go into all of them because I won't remember all of them, but there are a lot. But I think the most important one is that it has transformed our view of what happened on January 6th in 2021. We were looking at what has been described as an insurrection, an attack on the Capitol, and we were considering a story that connected the attack on the Capitol to a speech given by the former president, at that time the president, Donald Trump, on the ellipsis where he told them to go and fight like hell. It's the only way to save your country. And they went and they fought like hell. And I think the results of that are well enough known. That's what we knew going in. Very quickly, that has become transformed where that attack actually is not the center of the story anymore. What is at the center of the story is a conspiracy that has the former president conducting different kinds of things, talking to people, doing things, saying things, encouraging things, of which the attack on the Capitol is one spoke. But there are other things as well that are coming together in this large, what I think Andrew Weissman, the quite well-known attorney in the United States, has described hub and spoke kind of conspiracy, where you see how the attack on the Capitol is connected to attempts, for instance, to get the Georgia Secretary of State to find additional votes for Donald Trump and to create a slate of false electors to replace them with, which is connected to attempts to try and get court cases going to delegitimize the election of Joe Biden, and so on and so on and so on. So we're looking at a much bigger story than we thought we were looking at before, that has more spokes to it than we ever imagined. And I think the most important thing about the hearings, in addition to that, is we're looking at evidence, things that we may have had a gut feeling about or a common sense instinct about. We are seeing supported by evidence, and that evidence is largely, perhaps even entirely, provided by Republicans themselves, who were in a position to witness, in a position to see transcripts, to hear conversations that are fundamental to understanding what happened. And I think that's, a lot of what is so gripping about this is to hear people testify to these things and just be gobsmacked by the fact of what they're saying, that they are saying it themselves, right? So anyway, how does that do for answering your question?
No, that's a great answer. But it still leaves me with a question that I've had about it. And I think I'm wrong. And I'd love you to explain to me why I'm wrong. But I know that the president was trying his damnedest to overturn the election result. And that's a terrible thing. And Trump's a craven person that will do anything to hang on to power. But it wasn't really a serious effort. Like, it didn't have a snowball's chance of succeeding. It wasn't like Trump, the president, was sitting around with Mitch McConnell and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff planning this. It was him and Rudy Giuliani and the nut bars. Like, even the relatively sane people in his entourage were sitting this out. So why am I supposed to take this little putsch so seriously?
Well, I guess the most immediate reason is because it was the president of the United States who was putting pressure on other elected officials and appointed officials, and who was gathering people around him who would, he was trying to replace his own attorney general with another attorney general simply because a new attorney general would sell the false story, the fiction that there was massive election fraud. And he would sell that to people who could make a difference in individual swing states. And in the minds of those who were conspiring to overturn the election, they could use that leverage to decertify electoral votes. This was, I guess there's a feeling, and a legitimate feeling, that a real coup involves the military in some way. And that doesn't seem to have been the case here. But you have the will, as demonstrated in these hearings, of the President of the United States to overturn an election. You also have tens and tens and tens of millions of people who believe what that president says, even when he tells the most outrageous lies, and think that the election was stolen. So what you have is a cauldron of all of these things together that should make you feel concerned about the prospects of a continued democracy south of the border.
So this is a curious thing, because the Republicans sat these hearings out, decided not to participate. I don't know whether that was a good decision or a bad one on their part, but nonetheless, it could have had the impact of undercutting the legitimacy of these hearings as just a Democratic witch hunt. How important is Liz Cheney to these hearings?
Vital. And the committee knows that. You have two chairs, a chair and co-chair. She actually is the face of the committee, and that is deliberate. As much as they possibly can, they want this not to look like a partisan Democratic thing. They want it to look like a legitimate investigation into the facts, calling upon witnesses who are legitimate witnesses because they were present or they had knowledge, and that these people should be Republicans to disabuse people of the idea that this is a Democratic Party kind of dog and pony show. Yeah. And there are some people who will never be convinced of that the only criterion they look at is whether you support Donald Trump. And if you don't support Donald Trump, then you're a rhino in name only, which is, or you're a rhino or a Republican in name only, which is what they would like you to believe of Liz Cheney, which is a preposterous idea. I mean, her pedigree as a conservative and a Republican is impeccable. She just happens to be telling the truth. And these are not times when the truth is acceptable to a great number of people in the Republican Party who have hitched their wagon to Donald Trump.
Among the many reasons I hate Donald Trump is that he's made me align myself with a Cheney, who previously had been the evil forces of America, as far as I'm concerned. That's how topsy-turvy this world is, that we're siding with the Cheneys.
Yeah, and like politics making strange bedfellows is such an old aphorism, and yet never was it more true than watching in these hearings. I mean, it is an astonishing thing. I have felt the same way. I think on Twitter a few days ago, I was saying that people were looking for an analog to John Dean in the Watergate hearings, and I thought that's perfectly appropriate, but it's also appropriate to look at Liz Cheney and think that you might be looking at Judge Welch of At Long Last Have You No Decency fame from the McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. She has that same sense of gravitas and moral clarity that can just stop someone in their tracks when they stray from it. And she did so, I think, in the last hearing, when she pointed out that the new excuse that Republicans have was that Donald Trump wasn't behind this, he was being led along by it, maybe. And she just stopped it, saying, Donald Trump is not a child. He's 74 years old. He has the ability to make decisions just like the rest of us do, and he has to be held responsible just like the rest of us are. Anyway.
So I've seen some polls, Keith, that this is changing minds among independents, but not among Republicans. That I see no change in Republican attitudes on the basis of this committee. But so those are the voters. Is there any chance that in the establishment infrastructure of the Republican Party that this is having an impact? Are the Republicans thinking about themselves?
Yes. Now, I know that you won't object to me introducing focus groups into this, but there's a piece in The Atlantic just this morning from someone who's been conducting focus groups continually since January 2021. And they have been consistent in their support for Donald Trump until the hearings started. And so a couple of things are happening among Republicans. Some are sticking with him through hell and high water, and they don't care about what new information may come to light. Others are being persuaded by what they see that maybe there is something to this. Maybe he did something wrong. But maybe the most important group are those who are still with him, would vote for him if he's the candidate, but don't think he should be because they think he's a loser. And they think that he's a loser in part because of the things that are coming out. So that what they're thinking about is not how it affects their own vote directly, but how it affects their own vote indirectly. They're afraid that because of the hearings, other people won't vote for him. He can't win. Let's move on. He won't move on. We have to move on. That Ron DeSantis guy looks pretty good to me. I thought that was very interesting. I just saw it this morning. And I was surprised by it, and because I felt the same way that you did, that he had such a lock on the party. But it kind of makes sense to me that voters, even who support him, can make a rational decision that he can't win.
Right. What do you think should happen to this guy? You know, my friend Scott Reed is of the opinion, articulated on Twitter, that it is too combustible to convict Trump before the 2024 elections, and that would drive the country apart. I'm of the view that you stop this now or it runs hard, and that the rule of law has to stand, and it has to stand now.
Okay, can I just ask you something? You said that they should convict, or do you mean indict? Like, is Scott okay with indicting but not with convicting?
No. He doesn't think they should. He thinks they should pardon him.
Pardon him. Okay.
He thinks that.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
He thinks that Biden should pardon Trump.
Okay.
And that will itself weaken Trump because he'll have had to admit to wrongdoing in order to get the pardon. And that will take care of Trump, but without this division. I don't think that works, and I think it's outrageous to pardon Trump. What do you think?
I think you're right. I have great respect for Scott. And at the very least, he is raising something that a point of view that a lot of people share. But there are a couple of reasons that I disagree with it. I think first and foremost, it would set a dangerous precedent, and that precedent would be not just that the president is above the law, but a president who already believes he is above the law will have that confirmed to him and may in fact run again and become president again. And that's a dangerous thing. Two, I don't know how you can measure the impact of not indicting him. If he has in fact, what the committee is doing is presenting the case in public that the Justice Department is beginning to look at in private. And I think there's evidence that the committee is actually ahead of the Department of Justice, not only in terms of their thinking, but in terms of evidence gathering. We see now that they're going to interview people that have already appeared on television in front of the committee, and that's a worrisome thing. But the decision to indict or not to indict belongs with the Attorney General, and I think that's correct. The decision to protect the national interest or to heal the country belongs with the president. And I think if Scott is saying that the president should intervene at this stage and take it out of Merrick Garland's hands, that's one thing. And if that were to, if this process were to be stopped, it should be stopped by the president. It should not be stopped by the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. And I was distressed up until a couple of days ago that Merrick Garland might actually think that it was his call to make whether to try to make the healing argument, right? Yes, we found evidence to indict. We're not going to do it for the sake of the country. Not his call. I do think that there might be a process, or that it might be in the interest of the country to commute a sentence were Trump to be indicted, tried, convicted. I see a lot of people would like to see the former president in an orange jumpsuit with shackles and handcuffs disappearing behind bars. They'd love to see the image of that. It would be satisfying for them. But I don't see that really is all that important. What I think is important, first and foremost, is that the truth be known and the facts established. That those facts, if they can be brought to bear to sustain a conviction after indictment, that should happen. At that point, maybe it becomes appropriate to intervene, but not to pardon. I don't know, maybe pardoning becomes appropriate so that you don't go to sentencing. But people need to know what happened. They need to know that it was serious. They need to know that the president was held to account and that no president is above the law. And I think that is such a sacred principle that you really have to risk the consequences of what that might be for those who don't want to see that.
Right. Cool. Today, Herle Burlyites, I'm going to take you back to 1912 and a most cautionary tale. The Titanic, a story and shipwreck that's been explored, literally explored, from every angle. Almost. There's a link between this tragedy and modern wireless spectrum policy you're probably not aware of. And it reveals why it's so important to get that policy right. I tell it on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS. Spectrum, you'll recall, are the radio frequencies upon which wireless data travels. When Titanic set sail from Southampton, it had on board the latest in communication technology, Marconi's wireless telegraph. If you saw the film, and honestly, who didn't? It plays a prominent role. Marconi's system used long radio wavelengths that didn't travel very far and were highly susceptible to interference. Other, more efficient, shorter wave technologies were available at the time, but Marconi's company had capitalized on the luxury market for what was still considered non-essential communications at sea. Radio frequencies were often jammed, used for personal messages sent from the Titanic and every other ship. There wasn't even a standardized distress call that all vessels used. To use the colloquialism, it was the Wild West, but at sea. In fact, the closest ship, the SS Californian, had already sent a transmission warning it was surrounded by ice. But Titanic's wireless operator was so overwhelmed with a long queue of personal messages, he didn't pay it proper heed. There are other details I don't have time here to recount, but you all know how it ends. What's critical was there was no regulation to any of this. Soon afterward, governments began to regulate and divvy up spectrum for different uses, maritime, military, and media, prioritizing some for necessary communications like distress calls. If you've been listening to our stories from TELUS, and especially as digital technologies continue to advance, getting spectrum policy right is even more important in how we all thrive today, economically, socially, environmentally. We'll continue with Chapter 3, a compelling economic story, next week. Let's segue into media just for a second, because there's a couple things I'm curious about. You've talked about the way that the January 6th committee hearings are presenting evidence. I mean, they've hired genuine Hollywood producers to put together what is almost a scripted television show. Mm-hmm. And it is very effective as a viewer, and far, vastly more effective than a normal committee hearing would be of people taking turns asking questions and various things. And but how do you feel as a journalist about evidence being presented to you that way by a congressional committee? It's very packaged.
It's very packaged. Well, I mean, there are a couple of things to point out. First of all, it has been criticized because there's no cross-examination. And by that, they mean there are no Trump-friendly people asking questions, right? It's not a trial. And so cross-examination is, I mean, you know, this committee hearing is part of a process, but it is not an example of the system of justice of how it works in the United States, where you have to have cross-examination. So the absence of that doesn't bother me. As I've said, I think the most important thing is to get at the truth. And I think this is a way of getting at the truth that has proved to be more effective than it would have been if the Republicans that were chosen by their leadership to sit on that committee, I'm thinking principally of Jim Jordan, but others, who have established over years that their role on committee is to disrupt, not to enlighten, but to disrupt. The country doesn't need that right now. It needs a clear demonstration of facts and evidence so it can understand what happened, right? And I think it can be a little bit of a rabbit hole to go down and say, yes, but it's got to look like it's really genuinely bipartisan. You got to have people on there. You know, there'll be time for that. And there has been in the past. I mean, you know, in some ways, it's not unrelated to the fact that the Trump people, in particular Rudy Giuliani, have had multiple points of access to the justice system to make their case, 60 separate cases to present their evidence, and they don't take them up. They don't have evidence, right? So in a way, part of this complaint is a way of trying to buttress the fiction that there is some evidence out there to support Donald Trump's contention that the election was stolen when it wasn't. But finally, I think the most important thing is something else that I've said before. It's not like there are no Republicans on the committee. The problem with the Republicans on the committee, according to the Republican leadership, is they tell the truth.
Right. But what if Chrystia Freeland showed up for her next budget and said, instead of the normal budget speech, which is kind of boring, I've got a show about the budget. I've got a 1-hour produced television show about the budget. Here you go. It doesn't feel, the January 6th, it doesn't feel like you're covering like you're watching media cover an actual news event. It feels like you're watching media cover a produced television show.
Within which there is real news, right? I mean, there are other produced television shows that make news. I mean, that aspect of it is perhaps more refined and scripted, but it's not new. You could, for instance, and people have, complain about the way Trump's speeches are are covered, because Trump's speeches, and I've been to a couple, and been in the room for his rallies. They're carnival-like shows. They're not news events. He stands at the front and he tells jokes and he makes fun of all of our enemies together, and he libels the media and he libels whomever else might drift into his mind. But is that any more a legitimate news event than the committee hearings? I don't think so. Early in my career, a very wise person told me that it's best to stray away from defining too closely what is journalism. That journalism, to a large extent, is self-defining, and I found that a pretty good guardrail, and it avoids making judgments that aren't sustainable, that you can't live by, and you particularly don't want to live by when they don't suit you, and so on. This is something that we haven't quite seen before. That in itself is news, right? That is, by definition, news. The way it's being conducted is useful in terms of applying clarity to a complicated and sometimes confusing set of facts. And while I said that every hearing has had a beginning, a middle, and an end, the larger narrative of everything that we've been living through, we are still living through. And this committee hearing is not the end of it. There will be other things, but it is a part of it. And it is happening in a way that generates new information, and we have an obligation to cover that. And maybe there's a little bit of discomfort in that they control the microphone. We don't. But that also is there's a time when the media has to surrender the microphone. As you know, during an election campaign, the media has the microphone sometimes, but not all the time. And this may be another example of when the media does not have the microphone, does not have control, and has to accept what's put in front of it.
Okay.
Am I going to get a lot of angry mail about that, or what? I hate angry mail.
No, you love it. You love it. Still relevant, man. So it sort of feels like everything is falling apart, doesn't it? Labor and material shortages are wrecking our whole idea of normal. Airports are understaffed and clogged. The government has just ordered mobile chairs so people in line at passport offices can sit. Hospitals are understaffed and jammed. International supply lines are stretched and sclerotic. And thanks to Russian aggression, the world's food supply is severely disrupted. Well, our sponsor, CN, is doing its bit for the normal we all want to see return. The railway is now current on its grain shipments, and has been since last spring. That's industry talk for on schedule, no backlogs. And to ensure cargo keeps moving smoothly as we head into fall and winter, CN is spending some serious money. In Alberta, $365 million. That means installing tens of thousands of new railway ties and miles of new track, replacing 56 road crossings, and upgrading bridges, culverts, signal systems, and other infrastructure that ensures trains run on time. In Manitoba, the same sort of work to the tune of $160 million. In Saskatchewan, $185 million. CN will be replacing 151,000 railroad ties in my home province, incidentally. That's a whole lot of logs. And in BC, $390 million. Same deal. Further, CN is extending sidings between Winnipeg and Edmonton, starting similar projects at the ports of Prince Rupert and Vancouver, and double-tracking key sections of its western network. In plain English, that means giving one train a place to park and make way for a train coming in the opposite direction. In even plainer English, CN is making maximum effort to ensure cargo moves safely and on schedule. Obviously, weather is a big factor, and last year was brutal. But CN is determined that those things within its control are copacetic. That's a promise. One last media question, which is, let's say that the Republicans nominate Trump or somebody else who denies the facts from this hearing, denies the January 6th events. How do media cover that contest? Evenly, the normal balance routine? How does the media treat Trump versus Biden in an upcoming election if they were to run off against each other again?
What we hope is that the media has found a way to avoid what some people call the asymmetric campaign, where one side, because they behave in a particular extraordinary flamboyant way in terms of disregard for law, facts, and evidence, has to be balanced by something else. And if the something else happens to be just one little thing, and if it were Joe Biden, it would be Hunter Biden's laptop. And the laptop becomes the answer to everything that has come out in these hearings.
There's a Twitter account called New York Times PitchBot, which I cracks me up. Cracks me up, that thing. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean,
if they don't know about that, it's a lot of fun. And what it does is prank the New York Times for wanting desperately to see the other side of every argument, even if the argument being presented is ridiculous. Oh, it's ridiculous. But anyway, that's a very tough question, because the media is used to and comfortable with a certain kind of way of covering things. That is, somebody says something, you go to somebody else and they say something else, and then you've got balance, right? So you've got two opposing points of view, and they just don't know how to handle the asymmetry of an avalanche of lies, and maybe a couple of lies on the other side. So they inflate the lies on the other side in order to reduce, and they think it's balanced, right? And it's not balanced. It's destructive. It's harmful, and it's partly how it's a part of what people who cover the media say when they mean when they say that Donald Trump learned how to hack the media. They mean that he understood the incentives and priorities of the media, their sense of balance and fairness, and he knew how to exploit it.
I'm going to be interested to see the campaign. It's like do you mention in every single report on him that he is attempting to overthrow the government or did attempt to overthrow the government? I mean, Biden has maybe is spending too much and creating some inflation. The other guy wants to take down the basic system of government. How do you treat these two things?
Well, you see some examples. For instance, on MSNBC, some shows never refer to Trump without saying the disgraced, twice impeached former president. Like, that's just part of the boilerplate they attach to his name now. Almost all, if not all, mainstream media, when they report about his allegations that the election was stolen, they will say he's debunked, or his lie, or the big lie, or the proven false, unsubstantiated, no evidence for, all of these things. Nobody just puts it out there anymore. I guess the question is whether that's enough, and probably
and whether it holds when he's a candidate.
Yeah, it was interesting. He gave a speech in Washington, and it was not covered. It wasn't even covered by Fox, right? That's another interesting thing to talk about if you're interested. Fox News is stepping away from Donald Trump in a very clear way. But
what's the evidence of that? Sorry, let's follow that thread.
Okay, well, I mean, the first hints of it were when the Wall Street Journal and the Post in New York ran critical editorial saying, essentially, or it's not explicitly, I think, saying that he was unfit for office. But then you've had episodes where some Fox News anchors at certain times have said that what the January 6th committee is doing is revealing things we didn't know before and that are very worrisome about Donald Trump. But both Mike Pence and Donald Trump have spoken this week. Trump got no coverage on Fox. Mike Pence got 17 minutes. Who gives a shit what Mike Pence says, right? But suddenly they do, right? They're looking around. Murdoch seems to be, or a Murdoch at Fox and the Wall Street Journal, there seems to be looking at this guy like he's a loser too. I think that
there are cracks starting to show, right?
Yeah,
rallies that aren't quite as well attended as they used to be.
And focus groups that say that say essentially what Mike Pence is saying. We want to talk about the future. We want to talk about the problems we have. We want to talk about inflation and what's going to happen. We don't want to talk about 2020 anymore. It's boring. We've heard it.
I know. It's only interesting to him, but he's such a narcissist that he can't
He's
stop
such a
talking.
narcissist, and it's kind of fitting that his pathology should be his undoing.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's look forward first in the near term to the midterms this November, this fall.
Mm-hmm.
Is this still looking like the Republican blowout that people have been forecasting for the last year or so, or is there some hope that the Democrats will hold their position in Congress?
Well, there's certainly more hope now than there was a couple of months ago because of two things. One of which is the January 6 hearings, but the other is the Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade, overturning that and making abortion difficult to get or illegal and impossible to get in a great many places, and getting a lot of attention for that. And what that has done, if you listen to and I do listen to the political mavens of the United States who have experience covering campaigns more than I have and so on, or managing campaigns, your roles. What they say is happening is that because of these issues, what has traditionally been a referendum election, which is the first midterm after the president's elected, a referendum on the president, is becoming instead a choice election. And a choice election benefits Democrats.
You don't mean that in the Roe. You don't mean that in the Roe v. Wade context. You mean it in a choice between two options.
Well, the Roe v. Wade context is part of making it a choice election. Do you want the guys who are introducing even stricter legislation? Do you want that party, or do you want the party that says that it will restore your rights if it has the opportunity and will protect rights to same-sex marriage, all those kinds of things, which is a fundamentally different question than the question that Republicans were hoping for, which is Joe Biden has screwed everything up. Look at how much gas costs now and a dozen eggs, right? That's the election campaign they wanted. And that's changing. So I think, first of all, I think most people would agree that for that reason, and also for reasons having to do with candidates that have been nominated, the Senate is clearly in play now, in a way that like the Democrats could gain.
Right.
But the House could be a toss-up now.
Some of it's got to be the horrible candidates Trump has imposed on them. I mean, I'm watching this Herschel Walker campaign in Georgia, and I don't know if he's going to lose ultimately, but you couldn't do more to lose than he is doing. Yeah.
And it's not just there. In Pennsylvania, I mean, who knows what motivates someone to vote for Dr. Oz, right? Maybe they will. But I don't see how he was even a good, he wasn't even a sure thing in the primary until Trump got involved, right? So these things are happening, and those are the high profile ones. There are others that we don't hear about. And you can imagine that Mitch McConnell is tearing his hair out because he saw this in 2010. It was a big year for Republicans, but it wasn't as big as they could have been because they nominated a witch in Delaware and somebody in Arizona, and they can't help themselves, right? And I'm sure Mitch is going we're doing this again. Why are we doing this again? Don't do this again. Anyway, the whole landscape has a more hopeful hue to it today than it did a month ago, for sure.
So I was worried about, I had high hopes that the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade would really upset the apple cart in the States, because I have personal experience that in Canada, among women, that is a clear vote determining issue. If women understand that somebody's against a right to choose, right, a ton of women are just not going to vote for that person on that basis and what it tells them about them more broadly. So I just don't know whether that's true, whether that's true in Alabama as well as Canada, and I also don't know whether that's true in an economic crisis period of time, which is kind of what we're in now. So I'm a little worried that Roe v. Wade gets lost in the cost of living shuffle, if you will. But what do you think?
I think you're right to be worried. That there's no point to winning votes you've already won. And I guess the thing that's not clear about Roe v. Wade whether that was just going to, trigger women or people to, put a dent in the ballot box when they put their ballot in it. Great. doesn't really make a difference. But I think it's worth watching, because I think some of the people who will feel most motivated by that could well be the people they need most in places such as Georgia. I mean, Georgia is such an interesting case. And I think what's important about Georgia to remember is none of us saw that coming. We didn't see Biden winning. I mean, I can think of one journalist who said, you've got to keep an eye on Georgia, but it wasn't one of the 6 swing states that people thought was in play. So we don't ever really know how it's going to shake out. We thought North Carolina was more likely to go for Biden than Georgia was, and it turned out to be the other way around. And maybe that will be the case here. But I don't know that I'm as despairing as you are that the issue of Roe v. Wade and abortion isn't having an impact. It is defining the Republican Party, and it is doing things, like in Texas, for instance. Texas is a precarious place, becoming a precarious place for Republicans. And it's kind of put itself at the front end of all of this social conservative stuff because of its governor, Greg Abbott, who has clearly ambitions for higher office, right? Whether that means that he is willing to risk constituencies in Texas for other Republicans if it burnishes his image among social conservatives, I don't know. But they see things differently when they have like the scent of the White House in their nostrils, and they behave differently.
We'll be back in a minute after a message from our sponsor, Google.
What's the latest on the housing crisis?
Did the Jays dig the inning?
What's going on with passport lines?
Google products are designed to help you find relevant local news from reliable publications, big and small. Learn how Google supports news in Canada at g.co/news in Canada.
Yeah.
Oh.
All right. So what are we going to do about Joe Biden?
A lot of Democrats, I think I saw a poll in the last 24 hours, 72% of Democrats or leading Democratic want somebody else at the top of the ticket.
How can you not? I mean, I
yeah.
desperately do. I mean, I can't see him winning again. I can't see him winning.
I mean, it's such a tough question. Like, let's say that he has to go. When has he got to go? Before the midterms? That would do the most good, but that would seem the least likely. I'm not convinced he couldn't win again.
But why? He's lame ducked. He's lame ducked right now.
In what sense do you mean he's lame duck? I'm pretty particular about how he used that term.
I just assume that people don't think he's running again. And I don't believe, for instance, part of what you don't want to be with a lame duck is you don't want legislators to be able to disregard you because you're going to be gone and you're going to have no. I don't think people think he's going to be around after the next election anyway. Yeah. So why doesn't he just say that and take that issue off the table for the midterms and allow the Democrats to start the process of finding somebody who's a really good candidate? I mean, we need a really good candidate.
I honestly think that he could do that. I don't buy the lame duck argument that he becomes a lame duck if he says that. Because where he is now is essentially where a president would be in his second term. Everybody knows he's not going to run for a third term because it's unconstitutional. He still has to have an agenda. He still has to try to guide legislation through Congress, and he's still capable of doing those things. No matter what you might think of the way he's handled things in the last 24 hours, he's getting his Build Back Better program through. He's got Joe Manchin on side. Nobody thought that was going to happen, right? That was one of the things people were holding against him. He didn't know he's done that. I think that the age thing is all of it, though, right? Like, I think he's in a tough time. I think he's probably done the best he can to deal with the issues as they come at him. Nobody saw the Ukraine invasion coming 6 months before it came. He saw it coming before a lot of people realized that was true, and he gets credit for managing it well, I'm told. But really, the concern that people have is not with how he's behaved in office, other than those things that reveal the truth about him, which is that he's an old man. That is pretty much the whole argument against him, is it not?
No, but it is, but it's a compelling argument.
It's a compelling argument.
It's a compelling
It's not only
argument.
a compelling argument, it's an argument to which there really isn't an answer.
If he was a Republican,
Yeah.
or if the opponent was not an existential threat to the Republic, I would have a lot of tough questions about the Biden administration. I would have questions about his mental state. I would have questions about who's actually in authority in that administration, where real decisions are happening, all those kinds of things that, you cared about in the latter Reagan years, I think are highly relevant now. Mm-hmm. I find it very difficult to believe that 12 hours a day, Joe Biden's in charge of what's going on.
Do you think his fate and Donald Trump's are intertwined, that people can see him more easily defeating Donald Trump than they can Ron DeSantis, and that if it becomes, as Trump gets weaker, so does Biden in terms of the grip they have on their respective parties? Do you think that plays out that way? I haven't really thought about it, but it seems to me it might.
Yeah, it's an interesting relationship, but to get there, you first have to have another candidate for the Democrats. Like, I can't name a candidate for the Democrats.
Yeah.
Everybody who possibly would have won last time strikes me as a lousy candidate for this time. Elizabeth Warren's got the same age issues. Kamala Harris has got some reputational issues from the way things have gone as vice president. Pete Buttigieg, I don't think he's the right guy to run. I mean, I just don't see anybody hanging around who's an obvious, we should run this guy and he'll beat Ron DeSantis like a drum.
I wonder sometimes if that's the wrong place to look, because all of those people, whether we like it or not, is harboring their presidential ambitions just in case Biden doesn't run. And they probably see that becoming more and more likely. So none of them has a real interest in being the sacrificial lamb, which is what I think is necessary. Somebody to say, you know what, I'm going to challenge Joe Biden.
The Michael Heseltine.
The Michael Heseltine, who was the sharp end of the pointy end of the stick that got rid of Margaret Thatcher, and then that was pretty much the end of his own political career, is what's needed right now, right? Maybe Gene McCarthy is an example. I'm not sure how appropriate that is, because anyway, that's too complicated a question to deal with, right? But I guess the point being, you need somebody stand up and say they're going to do it, just so that people start talking about it and taking it seriously. Yeah.
If it isn't Trump, who do you think it is? DeSantis? Is that the obvious choice?
I tend to overcomplicate things. So I think the answer becomes, according to polls now, is that it would be Ron DeSantis. There isn't anybody that scores better. The Republicans seem to love him, and he's number 2 on everyone's list, and in some people's list, and in some polls even number 1, depending on when it's done and how it's asked. So, but the thing about it is that, the process of getting Trump out of the thing, I'm not convinced Trump's going to run. I must be honest about that. I think his behavior would be exactly the same if he were not going to run than if he is going to run. And that's because having his name out there is a cash machine for him, raising money. More than $100 million, right? He's not giving that up. And he has no qualms about pulling out of the race. About
probably his best source of income.
Absolutely it is. And he's going to need money, it looks like. But, Donald Trump is not the kind of person who's going to waste a second thinking about the future of the Republican Party. So he's perfectly capable of announcing that he's going to run to try to shut down other campaigns to keep the money flowing. And then at some point, withdrawing from the race, because I'm not going to run for president again. They'll just steal it. He'll have an excuse. He'll take the money and he'll run away rather than run for the presidency. I was thinking this morning about maybe, who else would be on the list. And a year ago, one person who would certainly be on the list would be Don Jr.
Come on.
Yeah, that's what you said when Donald Trump declared in 2015.
I know, Jesus.
Big laugh. Come on. No, but he would be, right? Like, he has been described as the natural heir to the cult part of the Republican Party. You don't hear that so much.
Tell me about Nikki Haley.
Well, I think that she had a brand that was pretty solid as someone who was a moderate as a governor in South Carolina. She was instrumental in getting the relegating the Confederate battle flag to museums and not parading it. It used to fly in the national Capitol until she got rid of it. Not on the top, but it had its own special place there. And then she got in with the Trump crowd, and she did well and was seen as someone who could be a successor to that. But I think her brand now is pure, unadulterated opportunism. Will say anything, do anything if it's good for her. And I think that not only is a bad brand for politics, but it doesn't make you a lot of friends, even among the people who might share your interests. And we don't.
And she's so soiled it with that, eh?
I think there's a reason we don't hear her name as often as we hear what's her name, Governor South Dakota. What's her name? I have it somewhere.
Yeah, she's a loon, though.
They love loons. That's the great lesson of the last 5 years.
Right, and
what do they love? What they love is someone who tells them, "You go ahead and you believe whatever you want to believe, because you're right, and I'll back you." That's all that matters.
Yeah, that's kind of what Poilievre is saying here, by the way. No?
I'll defer to you on that because I don't feel I've been back long enough even yet or watched it closely enough. But if that's the case, that's really scary.
When we were talking the other day, you were brainstorming about potential Democratic candidates. Like, you were arguing somebody who normally wouldn't consider this needs to step up for the country. Somebody of a certain stature needs to step up and kick the shit out of whoever the Republican candidate is.
Yeah.
Right? You have a name in mind when you're thinking about that? Like, who would that be?
So, like you, I've been trying to think of somebody who could do that. And for a while, I was thinking of, the Senator Sherrod Brown, who I've always thought was a reasonable person, and nobody knows who he is. And then a friend of mine correctly, I think, pointed out that there is only one figure in the Democratic Party who could create instantly the excitement about a candidacy, who wouldn't do it unless the future of the country is at stake and could be persuaded that those stakes were really that dramatically high. And her name is Michelle Obama. And you go online, and a lot of people think the same thing. She has been recognized or polled as one of the most admired people in the world, right? She, oddly so, has Donald Trump, but clearly for different reasons. And, I don't know what it is about Republicans that they talk this up more than Democrats do, but they do it in fear. And there has been polling done, head-to-head polling with Trump with the DeSantis versus Michelle Obama. And that's a tight race, but she wins it. It's the only name that really comes right out of the factory with the big name, the charisma, the respect, the adulation. And, if you've seen her, she's a hell of a performer.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But a real statement in the sense that, okay, you've got this group of people that are voting for Trump, voting Republican. They feel alienated. They're angry at the pace of change. Part of it's a reaction to the changing norms that the Democratic Party is associated with. So, one way, and perhaps the traditional way, and maybe the way I think about it is, well, we got to beat the Republicans, so let's take all that shit off the table. Right. Let's go nominate a straight white man so that there's not one cultural thing about this person that will cost you a vote, anything. And that's a sort of like, let's be as acceptable to those voters as we possibly can. And Michelle Obama's more like a, fuck you, let's have this fucking argument right now, right? Let's have this debate about the future of the country right now. I'm going to stick it to you with Michelle Obama. Let's go. It's a very different approach.
It is. But, I hear what you're saying. Let's give you your straight white man, Joe Biden. Would you rather have him on the ticket than Michelle Obama?
No. No, because I can't defend his candidacy.
Yeah.
Right?
So right away, like he is an important flaw in your argument. But I always defer to you or
yeah,
your profound ability to look at a population and a set of data and say this is where the answer lies, not there. But I just want to begin with Joe Biden. So if not Joe Biden, who is the straight white man whose light shines as brightly?
Gavin Newsom.
You think so, eh? I mean,
I don't know.
That's a good answer. That's a good answer. I don't know. I mean, obviously, I don't think he obviously doesn't have the name recognition that Michelle Obama does. Most admired person in the world. It is a pretty big obstacle.
I don't think you or I were on that list. Like, we should have been included. We could have done well had we been on that list.
It was rigged.
Yeah.
And we were robbed.
Yeah.
Rigged and robbed. But clearly, the number of people who don't know who Gavin Newsom is going to shrink to nothing very, very quickly.
Well, what I like about him is he seems ready for the fight.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, like, he's doing those things. He's not waiting around for things to, for the perfect moment to do something on guns, and not waiting around for the perfect moment to say something about values that he believes in. He was married to Don Jr.'s girlfriend for a while. That's
really weird, eh? You're right. There's a judgment question. Yeah.
Yeah.
No question.
Yeah. But
so let's end on a dystopian note.
Yeah.
Which is there remains some prospect that Donald Trump wins the 2024 election as president. It may be diminishing, but there remains some prospect of that.
Boy, this is unavoidably dystopian.
What would another Trump term be like based on what he has learned from his first term?
First of all, he would not hire anybody in his White House who wasn't loyal to him in the way that he defines loyalty, which is loyalty to Donald Trump above the Constitution, not loyalty to him as a kind of let's make the Trump presidency work kind of thing, but loyalty to him above all else. There was recently, like in the last couple of weeks, there was a piece in Axios, a series of pieces of quoting several unnamed sources, but people who were willing to talk about a second Trump presidency from the inside and what he has in mind. I don't know whether you saw it, but
yes.
Among the things that they were talking about was a wholesale kind of revamping of the interior of the administration at a very big level. So whenever a president comes into office, it's automatic. They put their own people in places in thousands of different positions, about 4,000, right? Trump people are looking at going much deeper than that, replacing as many as 50,000 people who would have to have passed some kind of vetting as Trump loyalists, so that there is no one who can have any influence in government, really, that doesn't have a deep, loyal connection to Donald Trump. This is a frightening thing. I mean, it's frightening because of just those facts itself. But then when you consider even if it weren't Donald Trump to be so insulated from contrary ideas while you're running a government is not a healthy thing at all, right? But this is downright scary. It is downright scary. I think that the main thing that you would learn if Donald Trump were president is that he would not make the mistakes that he had made in his own eyes in his first term, and principally, back to the loyalty thing. He would be a president who not only believes he's above the law, but believes the courts have now said that he's above the law, or the Justice Department has said that he's above the law, either by not indicting him or by indicting him and finding that he's not guilty, or even pardoning him. I mean, it's all just a horrible.
Plus the people will have found him above the law by electing him.
Yep. They would have gone along with that. Yeah, that's okay. All that stuff about not wanting a king, that's so, 1776.
Right. Surround himself with complete loyalists and no regard for constitutional norms or restrictions on him, presumably.
Yeah.
Who is the brains behind this operation? Like, who's thinking about a next Trump term? Like, it isn't Trump, it isn't Giuliani. Is it Bannon still around there? Is it
I think one of the
is
things
it Kushner? Who is it that's thinking this shit through?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we learned in the first term is that the influences on Trump are many and varied and not always transparently identifiable, right? So Bannon obviously has some purchase on his ear, Trump's ear. And Bannon is a bit fanatical about, the destruction of the administrative state, pulling it all down. And Trump, because he's not a thoughtful person, kind of likes some ideas about that. And he likes some ideas that flatter him that come from Bannon. So there's that kind of a person. But the other kinds of people are, Trump's biggest legacy so far is his impact on the Supreme Court. I think we'd agree. Those people, he didn't choose those people. They were chosen for him by the Federalist Society. And I think that was a glimpse into how...
What's that?
Federalist Society? Well, it's a group that believes that its understanding of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and originalism and so on is correct. And that it also includes things that wouldn't fit into that. It is essentially a very conservative group of people who believe that, the history of this goes back to Joe Biden and Robert Bork. They believe that they lost a seat. They had a seat stolen from them when Robert Bork his nomination was derailed. And the replacement for Robert Bork turned out to be Justice Kennedy, who they believe was actually a liberal. And they began plotting back then to overtake the court. This is never going to happen to us again. We're going to only nominate hard right conservatives. And that's what they have done. They have identified these people early on. Look how young the justices are that were recently appointed by Trump. They identified very early, like in internships in Justice's office, who these people were. And they began working and putting money into this to get them into positions so that when vacancies came open, they would be ready and available. I think that there's a lot to be learned from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse about all of this stuff. I don't have it at my fingertips the way that he does, but it's worth looking up, like his whole kind of history of how these appointments happen, and it's how he is on the committee that listens to the testimony when the nominees come before the Senate committee. And he doesn't ask them really very many questions. Instead, he puts up his board and he just starts explaining what is happening in the court system in the United States, where the money is coming from, how much money it is, how controlled it is by private money, what their interests are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really kind of something to watch, and it's scary. Scary.
There's so many factors like that. You can't get too close to what's wrong with the American system of politics and government without uncovering all this dark money that's influencing events all over the place in ways that are so invisible to even a pretty keen observer.
Yeah. And, all the attention on the courts, all of the attention, or most of the attention, gets sucked up by these issues like abortion and same-sex rights and so on. And they are worthy of attention, but what never gets attention are all the other things that protect corporate power in the United States.
The things the Koch brothers really wanted to deal with, like let's get the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, right? Yeah.
And I think we're beginning to understand better now how important it is to change electoral laws in the United States. Like one of the most profound things that they did was overturn Shelby versus Holt, I think it is. The law that allowed the federal government required federal approval for election law changes in what had previously been slaveholding states, right? And this was extremely important civil rights legislation under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. And they gutted that. And that is why we're seeing this flood of changes in states, particularly in the South, like that, where they're changing voting hours, changing rules about where you can have ballot boxes and so on, making it harder and harder and harder. They're allowed to do that because the Supreme Court said, there's really there isn't the kind of racial animus in America that existed in the 1960s.
Yeah, I had a guy on the podcast named David Pepper, who outlined this whole thing that's going on at the state level for me. He's the former chair of the Ohio Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. He's written a book called Laboratories of Autocracy about what's going on at the state house level, and it's pretty fascinating, and it's pretty dark because the combination of who controls these state legislatures combined with the Supreme Court gutting the federal authority on a whole bunch of things is a pincer move to destroy a lot of protection for people in the United States.
Yeah. I think that many of us reflect, many of us think that all of us are committed to democracy. And that's never been the case. And I learned that early in my career of covering politics when I was at a convention in Toronto, outside which there was a demonstration. And people were waving signs and banging, pushing. And I was walking outside of the Metro Convention Center, and a delegate to this convention, and I'm not going to say which one it was, I don't want to get into that, came up to me and then he just said quietly, "You mean to tell me that person's vote is worth the same as mine?" And he was serious, right? And I began to understand that there is this belief that's attached to the idea that there are certain people in our society who are makers and there are certain ones who are takers. And that fairness should mean that the makers have a greater say in society and in government and administration than the takers do. And what that means ultimately is that, democracy really shouldn't be for everyone. And that's what we're seeing happening in the United States, writ very large now, is that there is a kind of institutional belief that doesn't express itself this way, or maybe it does privately, but that doesn't believe that democracy belongs to everybody. It belongs to those who they believe by their standards are valuable members of society only.
Absolutely. And it assumes that people value a democratic process more than they value an outcome that they prefer. And maybe that's true when the differences are slight enough that you're choosing between Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter. But when you're talking about whether white people run the United States or not, I think that a lot of people prefer the outcome they want rather than a democratic process that yields an outcome they don't like.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, there is a serious problem with immigration in the United States. But the reason it doesn't get resolved is because people on different sides of the aisle have radically different views of the worth of those people. Right? Like the closest they came to actually real immigration reform was a bipartisan agreement in the Senate that was supported by Republicans, including Marco Rubio. And they sent it down to the House. And the House leadership would not put it on the floor because they knew if they put it on the floor, it would win, that it would pass. And they were not going to allow that. And that was in 2013. That was a wake-up moment for a lot of Republicans like Marco Rubio about who actually controls their party. They don't. And Donald Trump understood that way better than they did. And that's what he's exploited. An idea that what is happening is the Beijing of America through open borders, through liberalism, and eventually it means you're going to lose your country. That's the message.
That is what that fight is all about, and it will go on for a long time, in my view, in various forms and guises.
Yeah.
Yeah. Keith, thank you for doing this. Such a cool and interesting conversation. You're so fucking smart. Thank you for coming on this show.
What a nice thing to say. You know, I'm flattered to be asked because you're so fucking smart. And
there we go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mutual backslapping.
Two fucking smart guys.
That's new pod. Two fucking smart guys talking. We wanted to use that for me and Reed, but it didn't apply. So I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN and Google. I want to thank Keith, obviously, for being here. And I want to thank all of you people for listening. And hey, look at my shirt and my mug. There is merch. There's Herle Burly merch. Do not miss this. This is the best birthday gift you can find anybody. Anyway, airquotesmedia.com is where you'd find that. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We will see you next week with more Herle Burly. And God bless us. Hopefully it's as good as Keith Boag.
So thank you very much. Take care.